Okay, good day everybody, welcome. I'm Michael Eisenstadt, I'm Kahn Fellow and Director of the Military and Security Studies Program at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Today's event is about the Popular Mobilization Units in Iraq, and we are holding this event on the occasion of the publication of a new monograph on that topic. We have here the authors of the monograph, Michael Knights, Hamdi Malik, and Aymenn Jawad Al-Tamimi. The monograph is titled Honored, Not Contained, The Future of Iraq's Popular Mobilization Units. It's available on our website in PDF form. It is, I am sure, going to be the standard reference on this topic for some time to come. 200 pages long, including 30 pages of appendix with vital documents related to the legal and administrative framework of the Popular Mobilization Units, background of their creation, establishment, evolution, order of battle, commanders, some operational information. So this will be a vital reference, I think, in the years to come. And I think the authors are to be congratulated on doing an excellent piece of research. It includes also foldouts showing the formal organization of the Hashd Commission, and it goes into the discussions about the relationships of the various personalities within the Hashd Commission, Fallah Fayyad, Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, who was succeeded by Abu Farah. So anyway, it's going to be a standard reference, and we're very fortunate to have the authors here today to discuss it. The authors, as I mentioned before, will be presenting a little bit on, Mike Knights will be giving an overview of the origins of the PMU and their current state of play with regard to the creation of a new government under Prime Minister al-Kadhimi and his perhaps security sector reform agenda going forward. Mike Knights is a senior fellow at the Institute. We also have Hamdi Malik, who is the London-based Middle East analyst at Iran International TV, who focuses on Shiite militias in Iraq and has published with El Monitor, as well as the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And then we have Aymenn Jawad Al-Tamimi, who's an independent analyst and a doctoral candidate at Swansea University in Wales. And he has a really fascinating website where he interviews members of militias as well as does research on actually a variety of topics. He's really quite the Renaissance man. So anyhow, we're delighted to have them here today to provide us with some insights into the PMU, their background, and their future. I just want to mention that we will welcome questions from the audience. So you are welcome to start adding questions via the chat function right now, and we could set up a question queue. So let me just say, with no further ado, let me just ask Mike Knights to kick things off, and then we'll go to Hamdi and Aymenn. So Mike, take it away, please.
Thanks very much, Mike. So the study is one that has taken a long time to write, as my co-authors well know. Hamdi was really the one who kicked it off. A couple of years ago when we started to write about the Shrine Ataba units within the Popular Mobilization. We started to expand our interest across many other elements of the Popular Mobilization Forces, and eventually it sort of became a book. Aymenn helped us to bring it home in a very strong manner, filling in a lot of the gaps that we had in our research at that point. I'm glad it took so long because we got to see the Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis led PMF in operation for a number of years, and then we got to see a future beyond Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, which we wouldn't have been able to envisage, had the report come out, let's say last, spring instead of this spring. As Mike says, it's a very chunky text, but I think very useful to policymakers, to analysts, academics, etc. It's got a very nice 12-page executive summary for all you policymakers out there. For those who want to get a little deeper into the nitty-gritty of what should be done next on security sector reform, there's a really nice 25-page security sector reform chapter. So let me start by just saying that, as we wrote this piece over a couple of years, the picture kept changing. We got to see Kataba's Bullah and Badr monopolise the PMF. We got to see a lot of resource grabs in terms of national budget, in terms of also kind of criminal type activities by PMF units, economic activities, racketeering. We got to see some very severe command and control challenges, whether it be the Iraqi Prime Minister telling the PMF to leave the Nineveh Plains and instead the PMF reinforcing the Nineveh Plains, whether it be Iraqi police trying to arrest PMF members who were stealing cars and instead being shot at by those Kataba's Bullah members, even in places like Palestine Street in Baghdad, and then even the Minister of Interior not being able to arrest said individuals when he personally shows up, or whether it be PMF elements firing drones at foreign countries, Saudi Arabia, and denying then that they did so to the Prime Minister of Iraq, or attacking foreign embassies and military missions inside Iraq. By the end of September 2019, the Iraqi government was deeply embarrassed, and they passed Executive Order 331, which we detail in the piece, and we also lay out a kind of, on a pull-out map, which is delightful, the notional structure of the PMF if Executive Order 331 gets implemented. We saw them doing this process to try and get things back under control again, but it was really a failure. At that stage, I said to one of the most senior Iraqi leaders, I was talking to him in Baghdad, and he said, the aim is that the PMF should be honoured and contained. And, we call our study honoured, not contained, because, certainly the first part has been achieved to some extent. But the second part, the containment within the structure of the Iraqi state, has not really been achieved. A lot's changed since that late summer period. Since then, a number of key PMF leaders and units were involved in orchestrating the killing of Iraqi protesters and the detention or illegal detention of large numbers of them. Alongside many Sunnis who were illegally detained and put away in hidden prisons. That has then been joined by further attacks on foreign presence, inside Iraq, including the killing of American and British trainers. It was followed by retaliatory strikes, obviously, that killed Qasem Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis on January the 3rd. And I think Aymenn's going to talk a bit about how the resistance factions within the PMF are evolving since then. And it's also been followed by something of a breakaway by the shrine units, the Ataba, which Hamdi's going to talk a bit about. It's possible that we may have seen the emergence of what you might call a reform champion, which is one of the recommendations we make in the piece, that somebody needs to be leading the task of PMF reform, and it has to be somebody from a politically neutral background. The new Kadhimi government is the latest development. It will have around 24 months maximum in the job before it is refreshed by elections, and those elections might come sooner than that. Plus the government formation period afterwards. It's made a strong start, showing its intentions with a May the 11th raid on a militia unit down in Basra that was killing protesters or shooting at them. The government has made a commitment to find the private prisons where protesters have been illegally detained and to investigate the killing of protesters. The Kadhimi government also needs to contend with a strong and sustained ISIS recovery in a number of provinces. These are provinces where the PMF are ground-holding forces and do have an ongoing daily legitimate role in the fight against ISIS. But at the same time, the government is trying to undertake a redistribution of forces, a movement of army forces out into the rural areas, many of which are currently garrisoned by PMF, and moving Ministry of Interior forces to take police primacy within the cities of Iraq within a year or two. So we've got many moving parts for a Kadhimi government that's also coping with extremely deep financial crisis and COVID as well. The Kadhimi government will be having to make budget cuts. which means that they may well be having to make budget cuts to security force numbers, including potentially to PMF numbers, although security forces are often the very last to be reduced, particularly during a security crisis like the current one with ISIS. There will be more auditing of payroll. There will be more movement to electronic payments. And all of these things have a bearing on security sector reform involving the Hashid. Just to finish, in our security sector reform chapter, we do a couple of things. We identify what we would think of as the consensus issues on PMF reform, the low-hanging fruit, you might say, the things that are less controversial and offer a way forward in terms of evolutionary change of the PMF. One of the findings from this research, which is multi-year, very deep research, is that ultimately the PMF exists, and once an institution in Iraq exists with a significant number of people on the payroll and indirectly reliant on the payroll, it's very hard to make that institution not exist anymore. It has no defined roles and missions, which makes it unique within the Iraqi security forces. There is room for evolutionary security sector reform here, and there are many issues on which there's a decent amount of consensus. One of them is that the PMF should be capped at present size and budget, and then should be subjected to further transparency measures. That's true for all security forces in all parts of the Iraqi economy, particularly during this time of economic crisis. Another thing is that all the Iraqi security force components require defined roles and missions. And so by undertaking a kind of an exercise, probably with some international support, to help the Iraqi security establishment define its roles and missions, that will by its nature end up defining the roles and missions of a component such as the Popular Mobilization Forces. That may give greater clarity on a consensus issue such as how do you remove PMF units from the cities, which is something that even PMF commanders seem quite keen on. Some of them. What do you do with the local PMF forces who are recruited and operated locally? They never leave their local areas. Does it make sense for them to be folded into something like the Iraqi police service, local police, emergency police, as they would have done in the past? And then finally, it's a consensus issue that the PMF requires more professional training, leadership, administrative support. There is a desire to professionalise the Hashid, and that will include bringing in leaders who are more accountable to national command and control, but who can also be run through all of Iraq's military academies, who can get their staff college certificates. This kind of process of evolutionary professionalisation within the force, is a promising area for security sector reform. Under those conditions, talking about evolutionary security sector reform, not near-term demobilization, disarmament and reintegration, DDR, is probably the best way forward for the entire international community and Iraq to reach the point where the PMF are both honoured and contained. I look forward to the Q&A, and back to you, Mike.
Thanks a lot, Mike. Hamdi?
Yes. Hello, everybody. I'm going to talk about the Atabat, or the shrine units. Obviously these units are known not to have links with the Iranian IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. Out of tens of Shia paramilitary groups in the PMF, 4 of them are affiliated with the holy Shia shrines, or Atabat in Arabic. That's why they are called the Atabat units or the Atabat forces. Abbas Combat Division, Imam Ali Combat Division, Ali Akbar Brigade, and Ansar al-Marja'iyya Brigade. These are the 4 forces affiliated with Shia shrines and with Ayatollah Sistani, who is the highest Shia authority in the country and one of the highest in the world. Atabat forces have around 18,000 soldiers, give or take, and tens of thousands more reserve forces. In terms of military capabilities, Abbas Combat Division is the most powerful of the 4. As we mentioned in the study, Abbas Combat Division falls under Tier 1 in terms of military capabilities, meaning that in addition to defensive capabilities, they have a strong offensive capabilities as well, mainly obtained through their relationship with the Iraqi army, the logistical training and fire support cooperation with the Iraqi military. But it's very important to actually note that Atabat unit's influence does not necessarily come from the number of their numbers or the military capabilities that they have developed in the past 6 years. I will come to that later. But I would like in this part to give you some characteristics of these units and how they differ from the pro-Iran IRGC dominated groups. So they are known, the Atabat units are known to have patriotic tendencies, unlike pro-Iran militias who are part of the so-called axis of resistance led by Iran. They work on the Iraqi institutions and they insist that they have to do that, and other groups as well. That's part of the reform that Michael talked about, and they're seeking to achieve that reform. And they always had a very good working relationship with the Ministry of Defense. For example, they're not allowed to liaise with any non-Iraqi military figures whatsoever, including the IRGC commanders. That's a command they actually, the instructions they have received, and they have been abiding by those instructions since their creation. Unlike pro-Iran groups, they do not participate in the political process. That's very important as well, because these guys are military guys or paramilitary guys, and that's the problem with the Iranian-backed militias. They have a huge presence in the military landscape, but also they participate in politics, and they have huge investments in the economy as well, and that actually has created a huge problem for different landscapes in Iraq, including the economy, the reform of economy, and other areas. Importantly, the Atabat units do not consider the US as an enemy. Unlike pro-Iran groups, or even, for example, Muqtada Sadr, who considered the US as the great Satan and an occupying force, the Atabat forces do not express anti-US sentiment. So for the pro-Iran forces, they have to fight the United States no matter what. But for these guys, the story is different. They might condemn some American actions, like, for example, when the United States bombed an under-construction building in Karbala airport. I think it was in March. But they're not anti-US no matter what, this is you can see that in their statements, formal statements, but also in their internal conversation of talk to them. You do not actually get the sense that they are opposing the United States for no reason, just because it's the United States. Importantly, they're not accused of human rights violations. They're not interested in staying in Sunni areas. They participated in liberating Sunni areas in Mosul and other parts of the country, but they went back, and they are mainly at the moment focused on Karbala, Najaf, two very important holy cities for the Shias, and also the desert that links actually these two cities or these two provinces to Al-Anbar and then to Syria. So that's the area they are focused. And they are not accused of extortion. That's an important characteristics as well. Obviously, few pro-Iran groups do that in order to sustain their presence. They extort, and that actually leads to more grievances among Sunni population, which is an ongoing problem, which has been actually an ongoing problem since 2003. These groups, the Atabat, are seen as an example of paramilitary forces that Sistani approves of, and this is very important. As we explained in our study, Noor al-Maliki, the ex-prime minister, laid the foundation for the PMF, but actually it is widely accepted or known that Sistani's fatwa was behind the formation of the PMF, although he insisted that the volunteers joined the crumbling US Iraqi forces at the time, but the pro-Iran guys actually created an Iranian-dominated group organization which works in parallel to other institutions. And since then, Sistani has not been happy with that. His representatives read his messages in Friday prayers, and they never ever mention the name of PMF or Hashd al-Sha'bi. They refer to these guys as the volunteers. The characteristics that I actually mentioned put these guys at odds with pro-Iran militias, and they opposed Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis before his death in early January. They wanted him out of the PMF. Obviously, that didn't happen. And then after he was killed by the US airstrike, the Qatar Hezbollah tried to, as Michael also mentioned, tried to appoint Qatar Hezbollah pro-Iran guy Abu Fadak as the head of the operation part of the PMF, and they strongly opposed that. And they even went further and announced their withdrawal from the commission altogether, the Hashd Commission, and also expressed their intention to help other groups to defect. And this is very, very important. It can be very harmful for the religious legitimacy the pro-Iran groups have been enjoying since 2014, given them by the Sistani's fatwa. It means that Sistani is actually withdrawing his endorsement, and that's why a very senior figure in pro-Iran groups such as Hadi al-Amiri, head of Badr organization, or Ahmad al-Asadi, the head of Jund al-Imam, actually have been going to Karbala, meeting with Sistani's representatives to actually persuade them to come back. I realize that actually my time is almost finished. The last thing that I want to to say here is that the importance of Atabat groups it lies in the fact that Sistani for the first time gave the green light to creation of a paramilitary Shiite group that is not controlled by Iran and is a national force, and a young Shiite man in Iraq can look at them and be proud of both being of his religion as a Shia person and nationality at the same time, without feeling obliged to hate other sects or nationalities.
Thank you so much, Hamdi. And before we go to Aymenn, let me just say that for those of you who are joining us by Facebook, you could send in questions for the speakers to the email address policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. That is policyforum, which is one word, at washingtoninstitute.org. So, Aymenn, please take it away. Thank you.
Okay, hello, can you hear me, sir?
Yes.
So it's a pleasure. I'm talking about the what you would call the action within it, and how particularly since the assassinations of Qasem Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis at the start of this year, resistance factions, the first thing to note about them is that they're really having a kind of dual identity in a way. On the one hand, they talk about themselves as resistance, so the likes of Hezbollah, Ahl al-Haq, and Rai Khorasani, Kataib Sayyid al-Shuhada, and so forth, and Harakat al-Nujaba. But then, on the other hand, they also have these identities, registered brigades within the Sha'bi Commission. And part of the idea behind those numbered brigades was, in a way, to do away with political identities, although I don't think political identity of those factions, although I don't think that's particularly realistic. But, for example, you have Hezbollah's brigades 45, 46, 47 in the Hashid. Asai Battle al-Haq occupies brigade numbers 41, 42, 43. These are some of the long, bigger and factions, and so perhaps they occupy more brigades within the PMF. Others only occupy one brigade, so Captain as just Brigade 12, Kataib Sayyid al-Shuhada is Brigade 14, Thani is Brigade 18, so on and so forth. A key point I would make actually is that in terms of the first point I'd make is that in terms of their within Iraq's their role since assassinations of and Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis largely haven't changed since that. If for Kataib Hezbollah, it occupies having a operations command. This is the key in the study about Hashid military operations commands not properly integrated into the broader framework of the Iraqi military and its operation command. You have, for example, Kataib Hezbollah having its own fiefdom in Ssr, which they renamed Jurf al-Nasr. Kataib Hezbollah's and under the premises of 45, 46. Similarly, if you look at Din province, he runs the majority security portfolio in that province, and a very key role within that Din Operations Command for a lot 41, 42, 43. There is, of course, an exception in the city of Samarra, because that's actually Muqtada Salam. And then if you go further out towards the borders with Syria, you see also for the Hashid factions a prominent role for these Hashid factions in of the resistance within Western Anbar. So again, the likes of Kataib Hezbollah and also Sarai al-Khorasani, Sarai al-Jihad, and so forth. So their role on the ground hasn't changed all that much, but it doesn't mean that they think their position factions, speaking as resistant factions, think their position is all fine and good. They still very much continue to agitate against less presence within the country. So if you take, for example, Harakat al-Nujaba, its spokesman, has been very vocal in continuing to denounce the U.S. presence within the country, and claiming that the U.S. exit from Iraq is inevitable, and portraying the U.S. actions as a violation of Iraqi sovereignty and a dishonor to the resistance in the Hashid al-Shabi. Similarly, Kataib Hezbollah, they've also been very vocal, and they are particularly notable because they vocally agitated the appointment of Mustafa al-Kadhimi as Prime Minister of Iraq. So this was actually most notable in a figure called Abu Ali al-Askari, who operates on Twitter and Telegram, is described as Kataib Hezbollah's security official. He accused Kadhimi of being involved in the assassination of Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis and Qasim Soleimani, and also claimed he's not up to the responsibility of the Prime Minister. Now, of course, despite these agitations, these pro-resistance faction of these resistance factions, and despite their continued threats against the U.S. presence, continually calling on them to withdraw, the PMF structure, in a way, presents a problem for them in that they're supposed to be, of course, part of the official armed forces of the Iraqi state. So they can go and agitate against the U.S. presence under the name of the resistance, but actually, going forth and trying to claim operations against the American presence is more of a problem, because these groups also simultaneously are brigades within the Hashid, and of course supposed to be an Iraqi government institution, and the U.S. presence, after all, is within Iraq by consent between the government and the Americans. So although you see threats from these groups, you don't see them actually going all out to claim operations against the Americans. What you have seen, though, are a number of entities or rumors of new entities claiming operations against the Americans. So, for example, if you take one was called Usbat al-Tha'irin, or the League of Revolutionaries or Avengers, but on the other hand, the social media output or the ops of these groups don't look all that sophisticated. They use the style branding, but it's really hard to tell how much there is really to these. I mean, could they be, for example, members of some of these resistance factions using a new label to mask activity, and then at the same time allow the resistance factions that are on the Hashid Commission to say, well, we don't have any relation with activity, we're an institution of the state. It's hard to tell at this stage, although I say these new entities, their operations don't look all that impressive. When the US began withdrawing from certain bases in Iraq and concentrating in certain areas for a variety of reasons, such as attacks on the US presence, but also concerns about coronavirus and so forth, some of these resistance factions presented this as a sign of their victory over the Americans, bold in saying and trying to push for a US exit. The final point I'll make is that in relation to the new Prime Minister, there are a few things. So as I mentioned, some of these guys were clearly unhappy about the appointment, but they couldn't stop it. On the other hand, though, I don't think Kadhimi is going to, I don't think we're seeing Kadhimi taking decisive action against PMF or has really taken hard steps yet to try to reform it. Michael mentioned these actions ordered against a certain militia operating in Basra, the Hizb Allah al-Islami. I would mention that this is actually a very, very minor group. I don't even think they have, it's not even clear to me that they have forces registered on the PMF Commission. This is really quite a long way, say, from going after the pro-Iranian resistant factions as a whole. If anything, actually, the PMF, they emphasized Kadhimi's desire to work with the Hashid as an institution. They made this display of Kadhimi going and visiting the Hashid while wearing Hashid uniform. So yeah, in terms of reform and in terms of more professionalizing the Hashid and in terms of the problems that the resistance actions create, the assassination of al-Muhandis and Qasem Soleimani hasn't shifted things decisively, but some of these guys feel agitated, and some of them clearly do fear for their own lives. You take, for example, Qais al-Khazali. He's actually clearly reduced his presence. Saib al-Haq explains this as a result of his fearing that the Americans are going to try targeting him. So that's all I'll say for now, and look forward to questions.
Thank you very much for excellent presentation. So what I'm going to just say again, if you are joining us by Facebook and you want to submit a question for the speakers, you can do so by email to policyforum, that's one word, policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. So please send in your questions. So I have a series of two-part questions for everybody, for each speaker. So I'm going to start off with Mike, and I have a different question for each of you. So Mike, if you could just talk about a little bit about, from a military point of view, how did the various, we talk about the PMU, but of course there's internal hierarchies and the like, and in your study you talk about first and second and third tier organizations. How do they differ in terms of their deployment and employment, and in terms of the weapons they have? And then could you talk a little bit about the roadmap, the SSR roadmap? How do you see this happening? What are the necessary conditions for SSR to occur? And are there some units which are more likely to be amenable professionalization than others? Hamdi, if I could ask you about, first of all, what are the practical consequences of the withdrawal of the 4 Atabat militias from the PMU? I mean, in a way, being part of the PMU has a line item in the budget of over $2 billion, if I'm correct, and so it's a source of income. So I assume withdrawing from the PMU cuts them off from this source of income. So in a way, are they disadvantaged by doing that? And then second, discuss how the Shrine PMU fit into the larger competition, as a lot of American analysts often conceive of it, between Najaf and Qom. Okay, for the pro-Iran militias, very often their involvement in combat was used as kind of a way to burnish their legitimacy and provide a springboard for elements within those units to run for parliament. I mean, that's kind of like the Hezbollah model. How do the Shrine PMUs fit in to this competition, if there is one? I mean, can you tell us what the state of play is of this so-called competition between Najaf and Qom, and how do the Shrine PMUs play into that? And then for Aymenn, could you tell us a little bit more about the whole issue of Iranian command and control? There's debate among analysts who say that these units are under tight Iranian command and control. Basically, they don't have the ability to act on their own, although some people have said that in the wake of the targeted killing of Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, there is a greater degree of, kind of fragmentation and perhaps greater centrifugal tendencies, and some might act on their own now. So could you talk about the issue of rogue elements within, if that term is correct, within the popular resistance units, and the role of the Lebanese Hezbollah representative, Sheikh Mohammed al-Kathrani, who after the killing of Muhandis was said to have taken on a increased role in trying to kind of rein in these potential centrifugal tendencies. What role has his role been diminished? Do we have the role he's been playing? So anyhow, there's a full plate for all three of you. And meanwhile, again, I welcome questions from the audience. Mike, why don't we go in the order that I asked the questions again? Thank you.
Yeah, sounds good. So in this piece, we've got a nice table where we break out the PMF into 3 tiers by brigade. Not all brigades are equal size. Not all brigades have equal armament. Not all brigades have equal level of support from international advisors, meaning Iranian and Lebanese Hezbollah, and not all brigades are. And some brigades have also been advised Sunni tribal mobilization forces, by coalition forces as well. Not Iran, the other guys. So the tier 1 are really those that have a significant offensive capability, those that have what you might call expeditionary capability, including the ability to project power into Syria. Typically, they have significant support from the IRGC Quds Force and Lebanese Hezbollah advisors. They typically have intelligence capabilities of their own, including reasonably good drone components, tactical operations centers, intelligence coordination hubs, that kind of stuff. They often have some kind of organic artillery capability, either most likely a improvised rocket-assisted mortar and Katyusha type multiple rocket launcher, systems. Then the tier 2 are those that have limited offensive capability, that typically have to be operating alongside a tier 1 unit or some other kind of unit like federal police from the Ministry of Interior or Army. Those units are typically smaller. They're given quieter sectors. They don't do as much long range or clearance operations. And then the third tier are what I would call the local Hashid. They are kind of constabulary style forces that are very static, have very limited mobility, are really just like almost a village guard type force, with a little bit more mobilization structure amongst them so that they can cover a certain catchment area in which they live. And, a significant number of the tier 3 units are not from southern Iraq. They're, Sunni units operating in their home areas, or Turkoman, or Kakai, or, one of the other micro-minorities, Shia Kurdish, Faili. So typically on the tier 1 side, the biggest organizations, those that have a significant political component, those that are pretty close to Iran, their brigades tend to be in the tier 1 category. Many of the Badr brigades, the Kataib Hezbollah brigades, the Asab al-Haq brigades, which have been modelled by and put together by Lebanese Hezbollah in the early days, and that's continued, that relationship. Many of the enabler units, are also kind of advised by Iran and Lebanese Hezbollah particularly, the anti-tank guided missile units, the missile systems, intelligence arm, and so on. What's interesting is that the tier 1 units are the ones who undertake the largest role in the counter-ISIS operations. They also support Assad regime, Iranian operations inside Syria. They are difficult to demobilize completely for a number of reasons. First, they're muscular and well supported politically. Second, they do continue to play a role against ISIS in Iraq and in Syria. Thirdly, they have very strong Iranian government support. I think where the sweet spot is probably in the tier for security sector reform is in the tier 3 units, because they could be folded within other security agencies. They perform the same roles as emergency police of the Ministry of Interior and so on. And they want to continue operating in their home districts, just like the police do, just like MOI does. So I think tier 3 is the sweet spot, and tier 2 is, as Hamdi was talking about, where eventually the Ataba and the Shia religious leadership down in Najaf might start to peel away more characters from the PMF Commission, if the PMF Commission, does not change. Moving on to your second part, the Security Sector Reform Roadmap. What's really happening at the moment is that the Shia religious leadership in Iraq is doing a power play alongside the Ataba units, and they're saying one of two things has to happen. Either the PMF is going to change in leadership, in professionalization, in its relationship with foreign states, e.g. Iran. Either it's going to change, or we're going to leave, and we're going to begin to take more and more components with us. So you can either hand over the office, or the office can be empty. It's your choice. And we're at the very beginning of that process, and nobody knows where it's going to go ultimately. Stage 1 of the roadmap is leadership. Anything in Iraq that works starts with good leadership, trickling down from the top. Anything in Iraq that fails is typically undercut by bad leadership, no matter how much resources you throw at the problem. We have a good Prime Minister who's committed to putting arms under control of the state. The Shia religious establishment is moving more boldly than it ever has before. One of the great things about the Ataba project, and what Hamdi will talk about, I'm sure, is that it's a completely indigenous development. I mean, they decided that they did not want Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis to be replaced by another Kataib Hezbollah leader, Abu Fadak. Had nothing to do with anyone else. Internationals, security sector reform advocates. The most powerful act on the regulation of the Hashid has come from Iraqis themselves. So we may well have a PMF reform champion. The second thing you need to do, as I said, is to define roles and missions for the entire security forces. That will then drive what resources you give to the various security forces, including the PMF: manpower, money, bases, institution building. That's the next logical step, and as major security providers to Iraq, a range of Western nations, the coalition, the 80 nations or so, the coalition represent the vast majority of the G20 states, the largest economies in the world, as donors to Iraq. We have every right to say we want you to defend of your security forces because we're pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into those forces, as well as putting our people at risk to train those forces inside Iraq. Finally, once you then move to the third stage after you've defined roles and missions, which is that a redeployment process begins. It can't happen right now, but over time you're going to get a number of Iraqi security agencies, border, army, counterterrorism service, police, firming up, and that under those circumstances and wanting to professionalise what remains of the Hashid, you're then in a better position to withdraw some of those units from combat deployments into Canton for a professionalisation process. It's a little hard to professionalise forces in the field, and that's been our problem since the beginning of the counter-ISIS fight, which is you can't pull anyone off the front line, or very few people, to professionalise. But hopefully that will become more possible in time, and then you get a cantonisation of various PMF elements.
Thanks, Mike. Hamdi?
I think it's worth mentioning that the Atabat forces' status, obviously I'm going back to your question, is very vague at the moment. So yes, they announced that they are withdrawing, but actually they have not withdrawn completely from the PMF, especially in terms of their salaries. At the moment, they are linked to the Commander-in-Chief's office, who is the Prime Minister, operationally and administratively. And this is not a new arrangement. Some units from other military and security forces in Iraq have done that before. Michael actually can correct me, but I think, for example, the Iraqi armies, special unit brigades, 56, 57, and 61, they are directly connected to the office of the Prime Minister, the Commander-in-Chief, while being actually part of the Iraqi army. So at the moment, they're not losing the salary side. They are receiving their salary as before. But what they're doing is actually they're threatening to destroy the whole project of obviously this has been a threat so far, the whole project of Iran-dominated PMF by encouraging more and more forces actually defecting from the PMF. And it seems that al-Kadhimi, actually the new Prime Minister, has two options at the moment. He can either, what he did actually last in his visit to the PMF Commission's office, he gathered together the different elements, the Atabat element and the pro-Iran elements of the PMF, and he emphasized on unity. So there are two paths that actually the Prime Minister can take. One is to try to bring back the Atabat forces in the PMF Commission, on the condition that the pro-Iran groups actually give some concessions in terms of the reform that the pro-Sistani groups, the Atabat groups, are demanding, and that will diversify the command, for example, in the PMF, and that will reduce the IRGC's grip on the organization. The other thing is to let Atabat forces to completely defect gradually. That will happen gradually, especially in terms of the salaries and other supports that they receive from the PMF Commission, and also actually help them or facilitate the process of defecting more forces. from the PMF. That will leave the pro-Iran groups more isolated. But at the same time, the group will have more animosity towards the prime minister. It's going to be a completely pro-Iran group, so that's a problem that the prime minister will have to deal with. But as Michael said, his government, actually his tenure is going to be short-lived, and I'm not sure he can actually complete that. In terms of the competition between Qom and Najaf, the two very important Shia center, I think the competition is on their different perspectives of the form and the content of a state, a modern state in which Shia public live. And it seems that the Atabad forces actually fit in that formula. So for Ayatollah Sistani and the Najaf actually school, the idea is to have a so-called civil state in which the leaders of the government, the leaders of the state are actually elected by the people. That is it's as opposed to the Iran's theocracy of Vilayat al-Faqih, which is led by a leader, the supreme leader, who is a Shia cleric and he is supposedly connected to God. So that's the difference between the type of ideology or perspective Ayatollah Sistani has for the Iraqi state, or for the state in which his followers, the Shia population, live, as opposed to the Iranian style, because it's a revolutionary style, because it's a theocracy, it's more aggressive, it relies on actually nourishing more or establishing and continuing to have more actually aggressive stances towards many elements in the region, be it Sunni countries like Saudi Arabia or the United States or Israel. For the Shia, for the Najaf school, actually the problem is, or the issue is, to have an elected leaders who are actually leading the Shiites until the appearance of the Shia Messiah, who is the Mahdi, which is a completely different story. And as I said, Atabad forces actually fits in this perspective. So these are the Atabad security forces who are under the state. The state is led by leaders elected by people, rather than, so they follow the state's the commander in chief's actually instructions, because he is elected by the people, rather than following a religious leader in Iran, supposedly linked by God, and then when he receives any message from God, then he can say that, okay, we need to, for example, expand our presence in the region, or other actually plans that he has. So that's the main difference, and that's the main competition. And as I said, these groups present an alternative for a Shia individual in the whole world, I would say, not only in Iraq, specifically for Iraq, but even in Iran and other countries. There are many religious people who do not want to abandon their religion, but at the same time they're not happy with being at war with the whole world. And Ayatollah Sistani and the Najaf school actually is presenting an alternative for them. And as I said, they can be proud of the religion, but at the same time at peace with the world. And Atabad forces, as I said, fit actually in this equation.
Okay, thank you very much, Hamdi. Aymenn?
Yes. So on the issue of Iranian, the issue of command and control in relations with the Iranian. So I don't think it's the case that the Iranians, tell the resistance factions within this Hashid, go to this place or go to this place, or deploy that unit there, deploy this unit here. It seems like more that these resistance. There are two things. Firstly, Iran likes the Hashid Institute whole, because it's a way to divide the security sector in Iraq and to divide its armed forces and keep the state weak and keep the armed forces relatively weak. but in terms of the Hashid actions and what they do, they've adopted certain goals that are clearly in line with what Iran wants, which is, so for example, the Hashid resistance factions, Hashid in particular, when they emphasize the need for their role in security along the border with Syria. That's clearly in keeping with Iran's idea of there being this axis that stretches all the way through Iraq, through the borders, through into Syria, and so forth. And Michael had mentioned, of course, the issue of some Hashid units that have sent fighters into Syria. Well, it's no coincidence that in terms of the areas in Syria they focused on, in particular, were the eastern Deir ez-Zor areas on the border with Iraq. So, effectively, Hashid, one identity as official PMF force, the other resistance faction, both sides of the Iraq-Syria borders. Similarly, I think, if you look at, say, Diyala, that's a very key area of interest to Iran, and of course, no surprise that Diyala's security sector there is dominated by Badr, faction very closely aligned with security sector there dominated by its 23rd and 24th brigades of the Hashid. So yeah, I don't think it's an issue of the Iranians tell them, it's micromanaging the movements of these troops, but the goals of these resistance factions the Hashid have aligns with the interests, merges with the interests of the IRGC. So yeah, I don't think it's quite micromanagement there, but these Hashid or the pro-resistance factions act as nonetheless they act for Iranian interests within Iraq, particularly on, say, border areas and so on. In terms of some going out of the realm of control, so yes, this could be the case with some of these new kind of groups that have claimed attacks against U.S. forces. That this could be rogue elements. But on the other hand, it could also be people acting within the resistance faction and registered people on the Hashid, but they just have identity under which to attack U.S. forces within the country, and that, of course, could be something encouraged by Iran. Something encouraged by Iran and organized by Iran. The last thing I would make is in relation to Hezbollah. The main role we've seen with Hezbollah is in terms of acting in an advisory and training role for the Hashid, as Mike had mentioned. And this includes training some of the Hashid units that are in theory not supposed to have a factional identity. So the Hashid has certain directorates that act as support units like artillery and tanks and the armored vehicle resistance. The Hezbollah and even the directorates talked about this openly, about, say, the role Hezbollah would play in training and advisory. And similarly, if the tanks directorate, actually, this is something I'd heard from the directorate's media, that the tanks directorate counts among its utters, as it were, some of our Iranian personnel. So yeah, there's clearly been this embedding, advisory, training role. In terms of a Hezbollah role, though, in command and control, I haven't really seen much to document or support such assertions. So yeah, that's all I have to say in response to your questions.
Okay, we actually we're running over just now. We're at the end time, but I did get some questions, and so what I'd like to do is we'll go, if it's okay with you guys, we'll go over just a couple of minutes. I'm going to ask two questions, but please answer only one, okay? So I'll put out two questions, and you guys figure out, each one you decide which one you want to answer. First of all, one of the questions was that there is a correlation, for instance, in Diyala between the high concentration of ISIS attacks and a high concentration of PMF units. And we know in the past that in some places the PMF or the PMU units have sometimes been as much an irritant as they have been kind of a security provider. So to what degree is this still an issue that the PMU presence actually is a catalyst for violence? And are there still some places where you could say this is the case, or is it that by and large they've corrected some of the excesses they engaged in the past? Although of course there's the issue of the putting down the public demonstration. So let's put that aside. But just for military operations against operations, are they more a catalyst of violence, or do they actually have they provided security? And the second question is the secret sauce of these militias that make them, those that are effective, that make them effective. I've kind of often said that conventional militaries take people from all over their society and create a band of brothers. And very often militias start with a band of brothers. And so they already have these they build on these social solidarities. So can you say that this is true of the militias, or is it, those that are effective, they build on social and tribal solidarities or local solidarities, or is it mainly that they get Iranian or other support, military intelligence, fire support, and training? What's the secret sauce for those militias that have, or the PMU units that have proven effective? So again, please answer only one of these two questions. We'll do all three of you, and then we'll close up the event because we're running over. Thank you.
All right. I'll kick off. So I'll handle the sort of Diyala, type one, as it's something I've looked at a lot. I've got a new, on May the 25th, we got a new, myself and Alex Almeida have got a new West Point CTC Combating Terrorism Center article on ISIS attack metrics in Iraq, which goes down very detailed to the provincial level over an 18-month sample period. One of the clear trends from that is that in Kirkuk, we see a significant reduction in ISIS attacks over the last, especially over the last 9 months-ish. In Diyala, we see a significant increase in attacks over that same period. What I would say in Kirkuk you have is a concentration of federal forces with, for most of that period, a combined joint task force cell sitting alongside the Kirkuk Operations Command, acting like the glue, the Iraqi glue and the coalition glue, holding together tribal mobilization forces from the area with federal forces from outside the area, with significant intelligence assets, with air power, with planning support. That works. In somewhere like Diyala, you don't have that. You don't have a operations command where Americans can be present. That's not allowed by the militias. You don't have balanced local tribal mobilization forces that are primarily reflecting the local community, composition. You have more of a strongly kind of Shiite, and in some cases from outside the area, Badr militia force undertaking the operations. You can't do airstrikes in support of those forces. Because, we can't put observers on the ground. They don't want us operating around them. They don't want our drones anywhere near them, blah, blah, blah. So, ISIS, whether it be Diyala or southern Salahuddin, one of the things ISIS has realized is there's a nice shady spot where the coalition can't get you, where their intelligence won't be able to get at you, their strikes won't be able to get at you, the special forces won't be able to get at you. Wherever the PMF, the Iranian-backed PMF elements have got the strongest control, that's a place you can you can hide more effectively and operate out of more effectively than the places where the coalition is working very closely with Iraqi forces.
Very interesting. Thank you very much. Hamdi?
So I'm going to try to answer your second question very shortly. Obviously, the question of solidarity is very important for these guys. But also, obviously, the solidarity comes from the ideological perspective as well, especially for a revolutionary government or revolutionary state like Iran. It's much easier for duplicate the idea of revolution amongst some deprived, poor Iraqi Shia men, and obviously the idea of anti-imperialism, anti-the US, anti-Israel has always some sort of appeal among some people in the region, and among them obviously the Shias. And the fact that according to some Shia people, for the first time, the Shias can be proud of having a strong state. In their very long history of Islam, they have always been minority, and for the first time, obviously, the Islamic Republic, according to them, is providing this role model or a very strong Shia state. So that's very important. But also, Soleimani's role, I would think that was very important as a charismatic, experienced commander. He was very good at choosing commanders who were actually happy to work under the rubric of the Islamic ideology, Islamic Republic ideology. So there are many people who actually would go to Soleimani and ask for arms or ask for support in order to create a group, because many Shia leaders commanders actually in Iran want to be the boss, if you like, but obviously he was very good at choosing people who are capable of doing this. That's why he was able to actually create or establish so many militias effectively with not very expensive cost. These are two important factors that I mentioned. Obviously, there are other factors that we can talk about, but I don't think we have time at this stage.
Thank you, Hamdi. And Aymenn, you get the last word.
Okay. Well, largely to reiterate what the other two panelists talked particularly about the Diyala. So it's not automatically the case that it's the MF therefore equals more violence. There are a variety of things. So the issue of lack of mission activity bolster Iraqi forces' capability to counter IS. That's one thing behind why you have problems in Diyala. Also, difficult terrain like the Hamreen Mountains, and so yeah, that where I think there's less coalition support, that's where you're seeing more of the problems in relation to IS. Either that, or if you get a place that's relatively quiet, like Jurf al-Stakha, well, that's because which is dominated by Kataib Hezbollah, much in the same way Badr dominates Diyala. That's though really just due to the fact Jurf al-Stakha was just largely depopulated and doesn't really seem as much intention to let the inhabitants. So I don't really have any more to add. So I'll.
Well, thank you all very much. This was really, for me, very informative, and I've been very much enjoying. I read the manuscript previously, and now I'm reading the book, and so congratulations on a first-rate piece of research. So anyhow, thanks, guys. Thank you all in our audience. We'll be having some additional policy forum webinars in the coming weeks, so please just go to our website and check out and join us on Facebook. So anyhow, thank you very much, and everybody stay healthy. Be well.